healthcare, specifically for medical devices, and how it's used to create custom medical tools and models. I'll also explain how the process works and the role of information systems in making this all possible. So, what is 3D printing for medical use? 3D printing builds objects layer by layer, and it actually uses process or materials like plastic, metal, or resin. In medicine, it allows us to create patient specific models, surgical tools, things like implants, and even prototypes of devices. The special thing about this is that they are all customized to a person's anatomy. And unlike traditional manufacturing, which often requires expensive molds and large production, 3D printing actually allows healthcare providers and device manufacturers to make one of a kind, unique devices quickly and at a lower cost. There are many applications of 3D printing in healthcare, and it's used many ways in medicine. For example, you have anatomical models. These are for pre-surgical planning or education. It can be used to create surgical guides, which these are custom tools that help place implants more precisely. Prototypes is another huge thing, which are used for rapid testing of medical devices. Most importantly, you do have patient-specific devices. These are things like hearing aids, dental aligners, and even orthopedic braces. And then lastly, you have emergency medical supplies. These are things such as the nasal swabs that were printed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So for the manufacturing technologies, there are several types of 3D printers that are used in medicine. You have the first one being SLA. These are great for fine details. They're used for things like dental molds and surgical guides. You have SLS, which is selective laser sintering. These are used for strong functional parts like prosthetics. FDM, which is fuse deposition modeling. It's the most affordable one and is good for creating basic models or prototypes. And then you have DMLS or SLM, which is just metal printing. And it's used to create implants from materials like titanium or cobalt chrome. And as you can see on the right, these are examples of what the different printers look like. It also explains, its functions and what the pros and cons of each one is. So how does the 3D printing process work? The process starts with medical imaging. This is through things like an MRI, CT scan, or even an ultrasound. These images are then stored into a format called a DCOM. Then the software, it's actually with the DCOM, it's stored into the electronic health record through things such as Epic. So the nurses and clinical teams can view them digitally and on a computer. Then you use software tools such as things called Simpleware, ScanIP, or Materialize Mimics that takes his scan data and uses a process called segmentation, which actually starts to isolate the specific structures. For example, things like a liver or even a heart valve. The segmented data is then turned into a 3D computer model, and it's exported into a specific file called a ST file. And this is just a standard file format that's used for 3D printing. So after it's put into this file, the digital model is then printed using machines called, for example, Formlabs or Stratasys printers. Depending on the case, the final model can be printed in multiple colors and actually different materials to better reflect the person's tissue, bones, or even blood vessels. So when looking at the role of information systems in 3D printing for medical devices, there are many ways that it fits in. IS tools are extremely important for managing the scan data, processing images, storing models, and connecting everything from imaging software to the actual 3D printers. Things like picture archiving and communication systems, which is called PACS, are what store the medical images. And then software like the Mimics or Simpleware that was explained previously works with the PACS data, which actually creates the printable 3D models. These systems also include things like cloud-based storage, data validation tools, and integration with hospital electronic medical records, such as Epic, to support traceability and actually track quality control. IS platforms are what allow the doctors or radiologists, engineers, and even the printers to be able to collaborate both effectively and efficiently. So I actually decided to look at a real world case example. And in this case, it was actually for a live tumor. In this real life case, the patient had a tumor in their pelvis, which was right near the hip bone. And actually, the thing with this is that this area is extremely complex. There are tons of nerves, muscles, and even bones that are all packed super tightly together. So the margin of error was extremely high. They needed a precise cut in order to perform the surgery safely. So the surgical team needed to remove the tumor with extremely high accuracy while avoiding all of the nearby structures. Standard imaging gave them a good 2D view, but they needed something more precise and hands-on to plan the surgery confidently. And actually, you can see on the right side, this is actually the imaging they used throughout the surgery to be able to walk them through the process. So when actually looking at the process and how the 3D printing helped the surgery, the surgeons, in order to help the surgeons prepare, the patient's CT and MRI scans were processed through the software called Simpleware. This software worked by turning the digital scans into a 3D model of the patient's bones and tumor. Engineers then created cutting guides, which actually the engineers created custom surgical tools that were shaped to fit the patient's anatomy perfectly. As you can see on the right-hand side, you can see the person's complete pelvis, and you can also see where the tumor is exactly. So they use something called a Formlabs 3D printer. And with using this, they printed the guides and a model of the pelvis. And all of this, from the imaging to the actual printing, was only completed in 5 days. So the impact actually after using this technology within the surgery is that during the actual surgery, the 3D printing guides were placed directly on the patient's bones and they fit perfectly. This allowed the surgical team to make clean, confident cuts, and it fully removed the tumor while avoiding damage to the healthy tissue. So with this technology, the operation was not only faster and required less time under anesthesia, but again, it gave the care team more confidence in order to perform this surgery. I thought this was a great example of how 3D printing and IS can work together and how it directly impacts patient care. So when looking at how 3D printing is regulated in healthcare, in order to keep patients safe, the FDA regulates how 3D printing is used in healthcare. If a 3D printing model is going to be used in order to help diagnose a condition or even guide a surgery, the software it creates must be FDA approved. This approval is called the 510K clearance, and this basically just means that the software has been tested for accuracy and reliability. However, unfortunately, there are only a few programs. For example, the Materialize Mimics, Simpleware, and D2P that have this special clearance. I provided images of actually what the software looks like for each of the softwares. The Simpleware one on the right was what was used for the pelvic surgery. So with the software that have this clearance, the 3D printed and materials also need to be validated. So the printed models are confirmed to be safe and precise. Some hospitals can use 3D printing for education without FDA approval, but if you actually want to use it for patient care, all of these safety steps and requirements must be required. So, although it's an impactful technology that's been used in more cases, there are still a lot of challenges with using 3D printing for medical devices. The first one is that the costs or upfront costs are extremely high. Some of the industrial printers cost over $100,000. And as mentioned above, the regulatory barriers, there are many printers and materials that are not yet validated for clinical use, which means they can't be used for patients yet. Accuracy concerns remain a challenge. Errors can happen at every stage of the process, all the way from the actual image capture to the printing. A huge thing that is always changing, especially today, is the limited insurance reimbursement for this technology. Most insurers don't yet cover 3D printed and anatomical models, which means that providers are not getting paid to use this technology, which can decrease them wanting to use it, even if it does help a patient, because they can't afford it and it's not sustainable. And then lastly, standardization. There's no universal checklist that validates the print quality across all devices, so that remains a huge challenge as well. So when looking at this presentation, I came up with a couple of discussion questions. The first one being, how do you guys think hospital technology can help turn the patient scans into the 3D printed models? Some of the things is, how the hospital conducts the CT scan or MRI imaging, which impacts the entire 3D printing process. Another thing is, what problems could come up when adding 3D printing into a hospital's existing technology setup. Especially in healthcare, a lot of physicians are resistant to change. So this could create a lot of friction within the organization. And then lastly, what risks do you think there are when using a patient scan data in order to create 3D printing models? I appreciate everyone listening to this presentation, and hopefully you found it interesting. And I look forward to seeing your guys' answers.